legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Carl Abrahamsson, who joins us to discuss his book, Anton LaVey and the Church of Satan, Infernal Wisdom from the Devil's Den. During a long, colourful and controversial career, Anton Szandor LaVey became best known as the founder of the Church of Satan, which he led until his death in 1997. Although misconceptions regarding Satanism abounded during LaVey's lifetime and continue to do so to this day, he was determined to invoke a satanic archetype in his work, including the name of his organisation. LaVey's philosophy and that of the Church of Satan railed against mediocrity, conformity and passivity in a society increasingly pandering to victim mentality, political correctness and dumbed-down culture. A society in which excellence is scorned as elitist, self-reliance as selfish, and in which everyone gets a medal just for showing up. Instead, LaVey expounded a philosophy of personal freedom, rugged individualism, and responsibility to the responsible. A world in which beauty is celebrated, passions are indulged, and creativity runs riot. LaVey's influence continues to ripple through the outer reaches of popular culture, and not simply in music, at which LaVey excelled. In our postmodern hellscape of corporate control, cancel culture and identity politics, LaVey's outlook has more resonance and relevance than ever. Hello and welcome, Carl, and thank you so much for joining us once again on legalizefreedom.com.
Hi, and thank you very much for having me. It's been quite a few years now, so I'm very happy to be back.
Yes, as we mentioned off air, it was around your book, A Culture, The Unseen Forces That Drive Culture Forward, I think. I can't remember exact full title.
That drive me nuts.
But there'll be a link to that interview on this interview page at legalizefreedom.com. If people want to rewind and check that out, they can do so. But the occasion of our talk today is your new book, which is entitled Anton LaVey and the Church of Satan, Infernal Wisdom from the Devil's Den. Before we dive into that, just for people who don't know, say a little bit about your background and your work in general.
Right. I am an author born and bred and based in Sweden. And I think in my teens I got obsessed by culture, but a specific culture. It was usually called trash culture in a way, B-movies, dangerous books, all these things that are quite normal for an intellectual teenager. At the same time, I also got interested in the occult and started looking at books from occult history, etc., etc. And it just sort of snowballed from there. And eventually these two strains merged in a way. And I think the book Culture that you mentioned that came out in 2018, that was like a culmination, you could say, but something that basically summed up a lot of the things that I've been thinking about and working with and writing about and making films about for a long time, since the late 80s, basically. So You could say that I'm an author. Now I also author documentary films, but mainly I'm a writer, and I still keep writing about these interesting things: culture, art, interesting artists, basically underground stuff, but I write it for the overground or mainstream. At least that's how I see myself.
Now, in my recorded introduction, I've said a little bit about Anton LaVey and the Church of Satan for people who know nothing about him or what the Church of Satan embodies. So we're not going to, we can move over that. And if people can I suggest they just get your book. But the introduction gives people a basic grounding to get us started. However, I would just like to ask how you first discovered the Church of Satan or the work of Anton LaVey, because for me at the time it was back in the late 80s when I discovered a copy of the Satanic Bible, and at that time, I think we're of a similar age, at that time, in terms of books and music and cultural artifacts, there was no internet, so discovering these things sometimes could be very difficult to find, but we did have a global network of tape traders and people who would write to each other, and that the material gradually made its way from one corner of the globe to the other. But it was certainly a very different process of discovery compared to that which we have today.
Absolutely, and I think I had no problem finding the Satanic Bible, for instance, or other books of a similar nature, because there were, no internet, but then again, there were good bookstores, even in tiny Stockholm. And I remember there were a couple of occult bookstores where I sort of picked things out. You're always interested in Crowley, and you pick older things out, and anything that was sort of semi-controversial or seemed exciting. And the LaVey book was, of course, one of those books. So I did find that, I can't remember exactly, must have been mid-80s. And then I also remember reading about him a couple of times, actually, in Swedish men's magazines, because they used to write about dangerous or weird sex magicians, always focusing on the sexy stuff. And they even wrote about Austin Spare and Crowley, of course, and LaVey was there, because LaVey had always been, since early Church of Satan days, very media friendly. He had always invited journalists and photographers from all around the world. So those images were spread around the world and were also kept in print. It never went out of style. So I remember in my youth seeing Swedish men's magazines with pictures from the Black House, sort of 1966, 67, and I found it amazingly interesting. And that was something that fueled this dark fire also, plus my I would say infatuation or fascination with Jane Mansfield, the American actress of many qualities, and she had been a friend of LaVey's and a member of the Church of Satan. So there were many things that created this kind of satanic meltdown in my mind, basically, and it just stayed with me. And as we'll talk about tonight, it still haunts me in a way, but in a very, very nice way.
Well, I remember hearing LaVey's name mentioned by a metal band back in the 80s, and that was my music of choice at the time. It was the first thing I really gravitated towards, and of course, one of the some of the tenets of hard rock and heavy metal, the sort of the freedom philosophy, anti-establishment, outsider culture, all of that had some things in common with LaVey's worldview and his how shall I put it, his characterization, his embodiment of a satanic ideal as well. But it took me a long time. Well, not to say a long time, it seems that way now. It was probably like less than a year to find out who they were referring to, because they mentioned the name. What I thought they were saying was LaVey. Mm-hmm. So I was looking for some guy, Lavere, and trawling. I couldn't just go online. I'm trawling bookstores, and there was one unusual alternative bookstore in the next town, about 15 miles away, and I kept badgering this guy who wasn't particularly into, occult topics, but he had a lot of books on weird and wonderful subjects about this guy LaVey. I didn't know the first name, I just had a LaVey, and for ages he turned up nothing. And then one day he showed me this pile of books that he'd bought from an old guy, and who was, I don't know whether, I think he was moving into a retirement home when he was downsizing. And at the very top of the pile was this little black book with a purple, inverted pentagram with little symbols around it. And I just looked at it, and straight away I knew this is what I've been looking for. This is what they were talking about. It's not LaVey, it's LaVey.
Yeah.
So, and I got the little book, and it just cost me, like, at the time, a couple of pounds, like $2 or $3, I suppose you would say. And that was quite an eye-opener, because what I discovered in LaVey, and so many people speak about his work in these terms, in this light, is that he, for them, kind of confirmed reinforced, reflected how they felt about so many things, about world, the world and life in general, and about the human species. But they quite often thought maybe they were on their own with this, or part of a tiny minority, especially pre-internet. So for me, when I read Satanic Bible, everything that LaVey was railing against, the mediocrity, the complacency, the conformity, the passivity in society, the way everything was becoming increasingly inoffensive and bland and insipid and half-baked, and how everyone was becoming increasingly, like we were going back to medieval serfs time, becoming so deferential and obedient and dumbed down. All of these things that were in train in the 1980s and have only really gotten worse since.
Indeed.
It resonated with me so strongly. And for me, I wasn't reading it as anything, for me, people would talk, the Satanic Bible, so they immediately go to their own preconceived ideas about Satanism. But for me, these were like qualities that didn't have necessarily anything to do with the societal ideas about the figure of Satan or what Satanism might be as a philosophy. For me, these were kind of just perennial ideas, perennial wisdom, things that just made sense.
Absolutely. And I totally agree. And it's like there are things in every generation, or more things in each generation, that sort of touch upon this perennial. It's more than a wisdom, I would say also an attitude, because you can have a lot of self-empowering philosophies percolating in the culture or in the zeitgeist, but that doesn't mean that it appeals to everyone. Some people like black and not pastel colors, and although we can sort of like the Buddhist metaphor, take away the leaves and find the jewel in the lotus in a way. There's still this thing where, yes, we want to achieve things, we want to fulfill our lives, find meaning and achieve certain things. But what's appealing about the Satanic is that it's not for everyone. So it could never be mass market. It always has this sort of elitist or avant-garde, I would say, attitude to it, where it will not attract everybody. It will only attract people who feel on the outside, but not necessarily as some kind of loser outsider, but rather someone who hasn't yet found his or her place in let's call it the wheels of destiny or whatever. And I think that's very important, because you can find that specifically in art history also, the same kind of attitude or strain, people who refuse to adapt, people who refuse to go with what's being dealt, what's being given, what's being presented, people who want to do it their own way. And very, very often there is some kind of flirting or a hint or a wink of the eye towards so-called demonic forces, or to Lucifer, this rebellious spirit, or something, the rebel. Simply, the rebel is a good symbol, and I think that you and I, we found it through this little book, and also in the wider culture, it did exist in metal and things like that. I was never a metalhead, so I went straight for the book in a way, but I was aware of the references, and of course there had been shocking sort of rock and roll shows even before that I remembered, even as a kid. I'm thinking of Alice Cooper specifically, but there was never anything. That was always pure entertainment in a way. It wasn't imbued with any kind of philosophy or that kind of thing. But of course, when I grew up, there was also parallel to this a very, very vital underground music scene. I'm thinking of the one that's been documented in the book England's Hidden Reverse, for instance, the industrial scenes, and it was always imbued with a lot of intellectual fodder, and a lot of it was magical. And again, not pointing to some Indian swamis or politically correct things like gurus from the East. It was always weird people like Austin Spare and Crowley, of course, and LaVey was in there somewhere also. So I came to a formatting point, and from there it sort of grew even more into me feeling that I wanted to be not only part of it, but I wanted to be actively involved and a creative piece of this huge puzzle, which contains artistic expression, creativity in general, experimental magic, and definitely an identification with a very, very rebellious spirit.
Yeah, I mean, just speaking about music, you're talking about Alice Cooper there, had the sort of the sort of pure entertainment of that, and it was a great spectacle, and he's a very intelligent guy. But even Black Sabbath spoke about their music in terms of, well, we noticed that we used to go to horror movie matinees at the cinema, because it was cheaper than going in the evening, and we noticed that people like to be scared, so we thought we'd make scary music. There's nothing wrong with that. But it doesn't embody any kind of philosophy or anything like that. And I always felt that there was something in that music somewhere trying to get out. And this, of course, later did become more embodied and expressed by artists who did get it more and were able to put it the music and on a different footing. And this also spilt over into literature and cinema as well. They were able to get something of vital of the essence of what this was about, what this feeling was, and actually hone it, refine it and target it, rather than just the vague generalism of, this is dark, or this is scary, or this is the subversive or whatever, because that runs out of steam quite quickly if there's nothing behind it,
Yeah, absolutely. And so basically, I think, both you and me, we sort of came to the realization that there was such a thing as the Church of Satan. And for me, I was certainly aware of it, and I did sort of, I wouldn't say idolize, but I held them in great respect and knew that he was still out there somewhere. Although there was also this thing that was well known that he was quite reclusive, But then at this time, we're talking mid 80s, I was involved with the Temple of Psychic Youth and working with Genesis Peorage and it's very, very interesting times. And at the same time, I wanted to try my hand at making music myself. So I had my little rock band, and we were called White Stains. And the first record that we made was a 12-inch single, and in a song on there called Sweet Jane, just like the Lou Reed song, but it wasn't a cover. It was a tribute song or a homage to Jane Mansfield and her relationship with Anton LaVey. And when that record came out, Genesis said that, I have LaVey's address. I think you should send it to him. I think he would find it amusing, if nothing else. And I thought, wow, that would be cool. So I just did that. I sent it to the address in San Francisco and didn't really expect to hear anything. But I did receive a letter from Anton LaVey in which he expressed his gratitude and sort of acknowledged the labor of love from my side, and he also made me a member of the Church of Satan. And as you can imagine, for someone like me who romanticized these people and this sort of area of activity so much, I was mind blown. I was absolutely taken aback by how cool this was. And from there on, many things in my life became interesting, because I realized that I myself had the power to open doors, some of which I didn't even know existed, mainly through my own person, of course, but also through what I was doing, networking, making fanzines. I was working on the first issue of my occultural journal, the Fenris Wolf at the time, and all of these things led to many interesting meetings. But that first trip to the US in 1989, where I met LaVey and Kenneth Anger for the first time, that was really, again, like a meltdown, because I realized that all my fantasies certainly had the potential not only to be like internally fulfilled, but to become an actually manifested reality. And I would say that from that trip and onwards, I had made up my mind about what I wanted to do with my life. I just wanted to be in this environment and learn things and meet extremely interesting people, and also document it and write about it.
Well, a couple of the other things that really excited me about reading LaVey, discovering someone that was articulating things that I thought and felt were important. But again, I certainly wasn't getting from the mainstream culture at all, or anybody really around me in my life at the time, and this was something, again, I think that's really become like a festering sore in the 21st century, but it was there already in the decade we're talking about, the 1980s, and then into the 1990s, and on it went as both of us, moved through into our adult lives. And it was the kind of the idea of the lowest common denominator, enforced equality. That no one's better than anyone else. I've used better in air quotes because, how do you put value judgment on what's good and what's bad? But I think we both know what we mean when we say enforced equality. And the idea that everyone gets a medal. So why strive for anything to be exceptional, or to create anything original, or to leave a mark, or anything like that? Because everyone gets a medal just for showing up. And tied to this as well was the idea of a victim mentality. So, if you don't like your life, something's going wrong, it's always someone else's fault. Forget personal responsibility. There's nothing you can do about it, even if you wanted to, which is very disempowering. And also, by the way, not only does everyone get a medal, but that you're owed a living. Just by being alive,
right.
You're entitled to something. And these were all things that I was kind of pushing back against, that were coming to me through not just popular culture, but through, mainstream education. When I was at school, there was that idea was even happening then. It's like, well, you did come first in the race, but the person, everyone else as well, they took part. It's not the winning, it's the taking part. I remember that so clearly. Mm-hmm. And these were things that again, these are hot topics even today. Even saying these things is kind of like, whoa, hang on a minute. And the idea is that discrimination in itself is always a negative, even though, as I mentioned in another recent interview, it doesn't come with any value loaded in it. So you can say, I've got very discriminating taste in restaurants, I've got discriminating taste in music, and people, well, that's a good thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, I think that what made the LaVeyan universe or the Church of Satan and sort of everything revolving around that vortex in a way so interesting was the fact that here, as you say, you had this very clear cut and it's a Nietzschean philosophy presented for basically an American audience. So it's kind of stripped and in a way simplified, but not in a bad way. And that philosophy I felt a resonance with immediately, but it grew on me also that there's so much more to this than just some, the anti-stance, the rebellious force that goes against. There were many pro things within this LaVey's philosophy, and I found that very, very interesting that he was so creative as a contemporary magician, whereas most of the magic that was going on was either super conservative in the Western ceremonial tradition. Even the Crowley groups that popped up soon became yet another Freemasonic structured group of I don't know, too many people in a way. On the other hand, you had the chaos magicians. They were very prevalent in the UK, and Topi, of course, and so there were interesting things going on. But LaVey had been doing this since the mid 60s, actually early 60s, before the Church of Satan even, where there were many life affirming and life enhancing things, which is also a Nietzschean heritage. meaning that he came up with magical concepts that were not part of a tradition. They were actually brand new, and that's one of the things that has I don't know, irritated me over the years when I've been talking about LaVey with other, what LaVey would call occultniks, people who are obsessed by occultism, and they say that, he was just a showman, he wasn't for real, la-da-da. But when you actually read his stuff and look at the material, he was so innovative, he was so creative in his own magic. And I mean, he was also very generous, we have to say, to be sharing all of his findings and methods and rituals and attitudes, because he could just as well have stayed in his black house, enjoyed the royalty money, membership fees, whatever, and led a very good life that way. But he wanted to have his Church of Satan. He wanted to share his ideas with people he knew would resonate with it, because you had this distinct rite of passage, meaning the S word. Because if you come to someone and they demand that you explain, why do you call it Satanism? Why not call it something else? Why this S word? Then you know that it'll be difficult to convey the philosophy, because they are already, I don't know, programmed by their own life and background. But if you can't meet someone who says, whoa, this is really interesting, and Satan seems to be very interesting as a symbol, not as a real anthropomorphic thing, but as a symbol of an entire corpus of rebellious intelligent material from human history, the creative spirit, the one who goes against, the one who pinpoints and criticizes hypocrisy in culture. So many cultural strains have this sort of diabolical taint. And he was aware of that, and he put that in his own cauldron in a way, and made something very, very vital. So I think we should also not forget the one of the most important ingredients of his cuisine in a way, and that's the self-indulgence. We are taught today that, oh, you're just an egotist, or the ego is bad, and but I believe there's something we could call like altruistic egotism, meaning that you cannot really be good to someone else unless first you're really good to yourself. You have to indulge in whatever it is that you feel makes you happy and content, and which gives you meaning in life. Otherwise, you'll just be a little, a ball in a pinball game where someone else is controlling the pinball game. And that is sort of the most empowering thing about the LaVeyan philosophy or system. It's not necessarily the lesser magic or the greater magic, meaning the ritualized, symbolized activities that you can do to achieve. I think one of the most important things is this encouragement for being aware of that it's important to be self-indulgent, whatever it is. It doesn't have to be extravagant or even known or official. It could just be that you like a certain kind of candy and it's your secrecy, or you collect comics even though you're 57, things like that. But that's the thing that fills you with passion and joy and happiness. And he was right also. LaVey was right in the sense that there will always be people who will try to put you down simply because you're happy about your little private obsession.
Oh, a couple of things from all that. I mean, I agree with you about the life-affirming aspect of this philosophy, and actually there's so much positivity, because that's what I took from it anyway.
Yeah.
And also that, yes, the importance of that, that eternal kind of the rebel, or what the word that's often used in the context of LaVey, the disruptor, which again is another word that for most people has a negative connotation, but that's can be such an important thing. That's how life and culture and the species moves forward, is sort of punctuation points. When things become stagnant, then something disrupts that. Positive change, whether that's something that we proactively choose which is the best way to do it. If not, it will be forced upon us, That change will be forced upon us when necessary. And actually, rebellion of a certain type actually becomes quite tedious after a while, because a lot of times any type of cultural establishment or political or social establishment, wants that control valve of, quote unquote rebellion to just be there all the time as a way of, it's just like letting off steam. It doesn't change anything. I think as much as I liked a lot of the punk bands of the era, the original era, I also felt a lot of it was like what they now call controlled opposition. It was there to make people feel that there was some kind of big change afoot when really it wasn't. And a lot of these artists got co-opted into the establishment. And you mentioned this idea of selfishness and self-indulgence. Another aspect that the LaVeyan philosophy reels against a lot of tendency in society is something I've never liked, it's kind of two-pronged. It's this collectivism, nothing wrong with coming together to work on things of mutual interest, but the idea that we're all in this together type thing, like it or not. And of course, safety over freedom, and personal freedom being the bottom line in all this, and that's seen as selfish. It's like, well, if you're not with everyone on everything, then you're being selfish and you're threatening the integrity of the collective. And one powerful rejoinder to all of this, in your book actually, is the section on ethics from the foreword actually, which is the idea, this idea that a lot of people would, portray, a satanic philosophy as embodied in LaVey's worldview as somehow negative or destructive, or it's not possible for anybody else, to use another phrase from the book, any other people than those that declare themselves to be the good guys. Yeah. To be the good guys, to be ethical, to be moral, whatever you take that to be. There's many different versions of that.
Yeah, no, I think that's the thing, it is, the more you look at it, and I mean, you could say that, these were just some, cheap paperbacks that came out in the late 60s and 70s, and then he added some collections of essays in the 90s, and the last one came out just after he had died, the one called Satan Speaks, and sort of, it doesn't appear to be much, but when you look at it with the cultural or philosophical goggles on, there's a lot, as you say, to unpack in there. And I'm not, a philosophy student or a philosophy professor, so I wouldn't sort of try to categorize it. But obviously, it's I call him in the book Pop Nietzsche for the American market, and I think that's pretty accurate. In the sense that he popularized Nietzsche and his ideas. Of course, many of those come from Schopenhauer before. But there is also the beauty of him integrating his own life experiences into the philosophy that he then presents from the mid-60s and onwards, meaning working not going down any, academic route or the college route, but actually rather working with the circus and sideshow and learning all of these things and working with taming and taking care of big cats like lions and tigers, meaning being exposed to a very, very, seedy world in a way, also feral, literally feral when working with those big cats. And so he had a different kind of college education, which was like into the true nature of the human being as just another kind of animal and equally feral to the so-called wild animals. And again, also by trade, by profession, he was a musician, and he was a very skilled musician. And he played in some, highbrow settings, but it was mostly lowbrow, meaning he played at, dive bars and sleazy places and private engagements and burlesque shows. So he was in this super sexual, almost quasi-criminal underworld in a way, and identified with that environment a lot. Again, being on the outside, like an outsider or an anti-hero from the film noir discourse or description, and all of these things So he wasn't only someone who was occult. He was filled with life experience that people usually didn't have. And then when he sort of merged that with his genuine interest in the occult, he had debunked a lot. That was also sort of en vogue at the time, to debunk things. And he did his fair bit of debunking, but he did realize that there's something here. I think also it was activated by his being such an avid reader of pulp fiction and this thing, the so-called cosmic horror of Lovecraft and the weird tales people, meaning that there is some kind of dark energy in nature that we cannot and probably shouldn't try to figure out too much about. Just something there that we can sort of tap into in a way. And it's not necessarily, something divine or something demonic. It's just, nature at work. However, he realized that there are certain ways of briefly getting in touch with this energy, and that is through ritual, through the psychodrama of ritual, either on your own or together with other people. And he had experimented with that, just as he had experimented with music, with set design, with lighting, meaning manipulations of the space that you're in. That was yet another concept that he sort of conceived and was sort of groundbreaking in let's call it contemporary occultism of the time. So there are so many things, there are philosophical things, there are ways in which he tried to integrate those philosophical things into practical, realistic, tangible way of dealing with things, whereas most other traditions or groups or whatever, they were basically selling pipe dreams. The potential of the potential is great potential and very profitable. And he sort of took everything down to earth and said, this is this. I call it Satanism. It's not for everybody, but all the people who were attracted to it, they have they have really good things to say about it because it talked to them. That kind of symbolism talked to them, and I felt a strong resonance with that, and I still do. And I could never, for instance, accept or take for seriously acknowledge someone who claimed that Satan exists, for instance, like some kind of anthropomorphic beast or that kind of heritage from medieval Christian iconography, which was basically psychotic, But if you look at it from the point of view of a philosophy that's stern and strong, that is discriminating in the sense that there is a difference between me and everyone else, and I want what's best for me. Ergo, I'm selfish, but I'm also happy when I'm selfish. So my happiness radiates, my happiness inspires other people. So it's not about shutting yourself in some kind of black ivory tower. It's more a way of approaching life and living life to the fullest that, can inspire people. If it does, that's great. If it doesn't, that's great too, because I'm too busy living my own life, So that said, I think that LaVey, I think he once said that he had opened a kind of Pandora's box with this potential freedom that he offered through this philosophy when it's applied. And he was referring to, of course, like in the 1980s, this kind of brutal cocaine-driven freedom in a way of the yuppie generation. It was me, and they were just basically like kids. They had no rooting in any real self-knowledge. They had no rooting in awareness of the fact that we are actually social animals, and if we treat everyone like shit and just demand that they should do what we say, sooner or later someone will react and smack us.
That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalizefreedom.com.
legalizefreedom.com